Hi, welcome to Kingdom Comics Live. Hi guys, welcome once again to Kingdom Comics Live here on a Wednesday night. With no further ado, I'm going to bring in this week's guest, Mr. Grant Fraser, possibly Dr. Grant Fraser King actually. I must remember to ask him about that. He's going to be joining us this week. Hello, Grant.
Good evening. Doctor. It is Mr. Doctor is probably in the future, but not quite yet.
Not quite there.
Yeah. Few years of work ahead.
And there's me thinking anybody can get a doctorate these days. It's just
well,
a doctorate in anything. As always, everybody feel free to put some comments, quotes, anything like that. We'll try and deal with them as we come on. I'll introduce Mr. King there, and then we can start chatting. Grant's a good friend of the shop, a local man, big fan of comics for much of his life, I believe. And also a lecturer in mental health nursing at Dundee University. In that capacity, he's worked on some comics himself, which we'll be talking about during the course of the evening, no doubt. But as an aside, I'll just do the same as I do every week and say, "How are you, Grant? How did you get into comics? What's your comic journey?"
That's a very good question, Andrew. Thank you for having me on. And there's a nice howdy from John, who was, of course, last week's guest. And John is an important part of my story in relation to comics. We've known each other for, goodness, over 30 years. So I'm going to show you my first exposure to comics. So this is Tales of the Legion of Superheroes. And that's November 1985. And now, where you and I met was when you had the wee shop in the indoor market.
Yes.
But many moons ago in Kirkcaldy, there was another wee kind of similar idea but smaller venue called the Market Halls. If you're at the bus station in Kirkcaldy and you're looking down at it, the postings were always on the left, the cafe and the sort of bus office was in the middle, but to the right was this wee place called the Market Halls. And as I say, it was a smaller version of the indoor market, but it had these wee niche little kind of stands and a wee cafe in the middle of it. And one of those wee niche shops was just a bookshop, just one of your old wee kind of similar size to your place in the indoor market, a wee small bookshop. And I would be about 9 years old in there, and it had a cardboard box filled with what we called American comics. That kind of age, you had the Beano and the Dandy, and the superhero bright stuff was kind of, American comics. So they had these American comics for sale, and this was the first one I saw, and it just grabbed me. The faces, the emotions, the silhouette of the fight on the front.
Is this the same like issue? Exactly. You had it this time to time.
It's not. This is my second copy.
After, let's have a guess here. Did your mum throw all your comics out at some point? Because that's the general story that I hear.
So there's an appalling thing that I went off the tracks, let's say, in my late teens, and I had a huge single issue comic collection, and in a mad event, I gave it all away. In my late teens, and so now I've actually only got 2 or 3 single issue comics, only really by trades or graphic novels, as you're well aware. But I wanted to have a copy of this, so I searched and found a copy of this. And the very first time I read it, there's just this brilliant fight scene. The centre of it is Karate Kid versus Nemesis Kid, and from then I was just kind of obsessed with just the brightness that was engaging. It just, life wasn't always super happy as a kid, so it took me in another world. And probably Sorry, go on.
I was going to say that comic in particular. I was speaking about Legion of Superhero a couple of weeks ago on
Right.
one of the shows. They're possibly doing a movie with a Supergirl-led Legion of Superheroes.
Okay.
But I had stacks of them myself back in the 80s. And you talk about the brightness and the vibrancy of them. You know one thing about the Legion of Superheroes? It was unendingly hopeful. There was never
Yes.
bad endings in Legion of Superheroes. Everything was always wrapped up nicely, and it was it was like in the 30th century, everything can work out right. And yeah, it was a brilliant comic, I must admit.
Well, the other thing that struck me was this. Oh, and there's Louise. Oh, I know it's a long story, Louise. It's a terrible story. I hope I've redeemed myself by spending a vast fortune since then, building a big collection. But it was this advert as well. Now, I had these. I don't know if you had these superpower toys, but I remember I had Hawkman, I had Flash, and the adverts. Even the adverts in these comics were just like, from another world.
Yeah.
It just was so engaging. And so I fairly quickly built up a collection. This is when you would go into these old bookshops and they were like 10, 20, 50 pence maximum for these older kind of comics. They had no idea the value of them. Gathered them in a little wicker basket. Still remember that as a child. And then when I got to high school, well, we've had, there you go, John saying the Legion of Superhero Love came from Grant. Well, it was meeting John and it was meeting Colin, who was commenting last week as well, who's a big Star Wars guy. But actually just having that reinforcement from some other people, because until then, my comic love was just entirely me on my own loving it, and then meeting other people that were interested in comics. I have very fond memories with John and Colin sitting in our kind of teenage years. John's gran lived around the corner, Colin's gran lived across the road from me. We walked back and forth to school. We'd sit out on the grass reading the comics together, and it was just a kind of great childhood in some ways.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the Legion of Superheroes was the start for me.
It was your Access comic. I mean, I had a similar. Obviously, I'm a wee bit older than you guys, only a few years, but I didn't have like anybody else in the village that I lived in who was friendly with me in that year. I tell a lie, there was one lad, but then he left school and was taken away to a public school. He went away to a posher school because he was very bright. But yeah, I didn't really have anybody that would sit and read comics with until I was, through my teenage years. Until I started doing this, probably. So I'm slightly envious of young Grant and young John sitting in the comics.
Sitting in the grass reading comics, and it was just, and this is obviously years before the explosion of Marvel movies, particularly, which I think has been one of the significant step changes in sort of cultural and societal views on comics. But yeah, I think if anything, that kind of opportunity to be with people and not, okay, so we were geeks at school, but it was fine because there was lots, as Louise and as mentioned there as well, was probably in that category undoubtedly, so it gave you a place. The other thing I think was that it just gave me a great love of reading, whether it was fiction, whether it was fact,
I think I was the same. I think comics were my gateway at maybe 8 or 10 or 11 to discovering at that age C.S. Lewis and then J.R.R. Tolkien and then eventually Robert Heinlein and it got comics like Amazing and things like that got me into science fiction. And I became a massive,
Oh wow! Your book collection's insane, really.
I'm surrounded by books, thousands of books. Like so yeah, comics is. I always said with my own kids growing up, I didn't mind what they're reading as long as they're reading, not reading them about comics or Harry Potter. Still, reading isn't
absolutely.
So.
The other thing John obviously was a really fantastic artist, and also have to say I've always really admired his encyclopedic knowledge. I'm not one of those comic geeks who seems to have that encyclopedic knowledge that can just recall lots and lots of things, so I had to do a wee bit of preparation for the day. But the other thing it did for me was very much inform, and you know this, Andrew, I'm a great fan of photography. I love taking pictures. My Instagram every day has got something.
I love your Instagram artwork. It's I think you've got a great eye.
And you've said that, and I really appreciate it. But I've always thought that it was the framing of the comic that taught me how to frame a picture. You know, I maybe wasn't as conscious at the time as I thought, but the more I've reflected on it, I've thought, actually, I've exposed myself throughout my life to look into these individual pieces of art framed. Give the right, you know.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that, because, you know, I took a photography class once many years ago, and I had to explain to me that, you know, anyone can take a photo, but it's framing which makes a photographer.
Yeah.
You know, we can all go on holiday, we can all take 100 snaps, we can all see a castle that we like and things like this. But, you know, there's a difference between that and somebody who can look at it and think, this is the angle I want.
Yep.
These are the, you know, there's a term for it, for setting it up, and you know, you've got the magic circle sort of thing with your eyes drawn to it and things like this. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going there.
And so for something that's often perceived as a childlike experience, and we all know that comics aren't, we know there's a perception of that. You know, people are reading, people are thinking about art, people are thinking about things. For me, like photography is actually one of the things I love about comics, is it gives this opportunity for a very multiple, kind of different layered approach. You know, you can just read it for the action, and I'm a fanboy, you know, I like it for the action, but you can also use it as a means of communicating some incredibly powerful visual messages, narrative messages, and most importantly, the relationship between the image and the narrative is profound. And then a step further, you've got the external narrative, but you've also got the internal narrative of the character. You know, so there's very few mediums give you what, you know, an internal and external experience at the same time. And I'll probably come on why I use that in sort of mental health teaching a lot, because that opportunity to look at either the congruence or the dissonance between what someone's saying and how they're acting and what's happening internally for them, you know, can be profoundly different. Comics can show us that.
I think there's a great example of that was a year or so ago, or a couple of years possibly. It was a Fantastic Four issue, where the Fantastic Four met the Guardians of the Galaxy, and
got the Fantastic Four there as one of my prompts.
And there was an instance where, I don't know why I would think it, because Fantastic Four didn't have a telepath, but there was a telepath there, possibly Jean Grey, and they met Groot, and Groot said, "I am Groot," but the bubble above his head, what he's thinking was, "My name is Groot. I'm very pleased to meet you." You know, and it gave the whole thing.
Was that the trial of Jean Grey, maybe? You know? Possibly,
yeah. I remember seeing the panel and thinking, that's absolute genius. You know, they allude to it in the comics and in the movies that, you know, they can when he says "I am Groot," they can understand the different things he's saying because of inflection and stuff like this. But yeah, his, you know, I thought it was a good moment. And yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, with books, it's the same, particularly if they're told in the first person. You get to know what the person is thinking. That's why I think there's been a massive push recently. A lot of the more famous authors, a lot of the biggest authors, where they're writing multiple character books. Tell it from the point of view of multiple characters, rather than doing a first person. You know, like Game of Thrones is told from the first person point of view of multiple characters, so you get to know what they're thinking and feeling and stuff like this on the chapters where they're the narrator. And yeah, third person like a movie, for instance, doesn't give you that.
It's a kind of singular perspective, and all of us are very well aware of it. In life, there is essentially no truth. There's perspective, and only by kind of exploring different perspectives do we as humans kind of grow and evolve emotionally, psychologically, by being able to take on other points of view, you know, rather than being kind of solely focused on our own narrative and believing that to be true. Which, you know, you and I are both fairly political. We talk a lot about that. And you know, and the ability, I think, in our current climate to actually consider other people's points of view rather than remain in a singular echo chamber of your own views is a healthy thing. And you know, I don't think it's too far fetched. I mean, when you look, so just think about some important aspects of comics. You know, I mean, you look at something like Mouse. Now, I'm a in some ways probably a popcorn fanboy in terms of most of the stuff I like is mainstream superhero big stories. But I've also got a particular interest in using comics to talk about serious matters,
Yes.
and to present it in an engaging way. And, you know, folk that are familiar with Mouse will know that, you know, it's the story of the Holocaust, where they use animals as metaphors for different groups, organisations and races within that time period. And it tells it magnificently, because it slightly disarms us, gives us something, you know, metaphorically accessible, and then hits you a profound sort of, you know, kind of story and understanding underneath it.
Yeah, I mean, Mouse is phenomenal. Obviously, it won every award comics had to give the year it came out. You know, it just, it was a game changer for what comics is capable of.
Which kind of takes me to my second comic. So my first comic was Legion of Superheroes, and that was my, you know, as I say, sort of, my Hollywood bit. The other one, which, you know, it came out in 1982, but I didn't find it till a few years later, was Raymond Briggs's Amazing When the Wind Blows.
Okay.
You know, I mean, to me, this is one of the greatest pieces of literature ever. I mean, as a younger boy, and again, politically, you know, this week makes a lot of sense, to actually be able to consider the nuclear Holocaust as well as having had the Holocaust in the house was a profound experience. You know, and it definitely impacted me as a boy to sort of see the story presented again in an accessible way, but with a most profound human experience at the centre of it.
I mean, that was written in the heart of the Cold War, when people were genuinely worried about the nuclear Holocaust, and yeah, I mean, it's an astonishingly powerful piece of work from a man better known for, you know, his strongmen. So, I remember, I had that one. I've read that one many times, and it's
and it's still incredibly popular. I Instagrammed a picture of it just a month or two ago, and I was really surprised just how much kind of engagement I got around people remembering it, people saying, "Oh my goodness, I must pick that up again." You know, that's a kind of was a real kind of moment in my childhood reading that. So, you know, there is fun, but there's also deep learning alongside it. I don't know if you've seen this one. This is the other single issue I've got. It's called I Saw It. And this is the story of Hiroshima, written by a survivor, Keiji Nakazawa, who survived the bombing.
He was there.
Yeah, he was there. So this is sort of his story of that experience. Again, you know, we've just looked at some of the most profound parts of human history presented in a way for young people as well as kind of older, you know, folk like us to be able to engage and understand history.
Absolutely, I think you know the 20th century was defined by the Holocaust and the nuclear bomb, and those, you know, those two things, those two comics talk of you know, massive societal change that came from the end of the Second World War.
And again, I think the visual combined with the narrative is why it becomes particularly powerful. I mean, you could read the narrative in a book, but just that relationship between. Are you waiting for us to talk about the bunny?
Every week he talks about the bunny. Yeah. I mean, these are obviously very high-profile, you know, smart comics, and you know, that's. What is it? I'm trying to say. That's an example of how well the medium can work across all age groups and all interests. You know, because some comics at the other end of the scale, you've got comics which are just gratuitous violence, just, you know, semi-gratuitous, semi-nudity, and things like that. And at the other end of the scale, they can tell amazing stories based on basically anything. So Ian saying you loved Mouse, game-changing literacy. Yeah, I think like say Mouse won every award in I think it was nominated for literary awards, much like Watchmen was nominated for, you know, like a Booker Prize type thing, not the Booker Prize, but you know, it spent time on the New York Times bestseller list.
And then I mean, you know, and we'll know how popular Watchmen has been, but again, they're centred on a fascist political state, repression, you know, very common themes, you know, for all of us to have, you know, that we should be thinking about and introducing to younger people, maybe, you know, through that kind of medium, to allow them to explore history and allow them to explore things like politics as well as have fun. And I'm quite clear, I'm very lucky I get to spend my life as a fanboy reading X-Men at night, but in my work being able to apply a kind of more kind of academic, serious kind of lens into these things. And I'm very lucky because I work at the University of Dundee. We've got the Centre of Comic Studies there. We've got the only professor of comic studies, Chris Murray, who's there. And I know Chris well. I worked with him a few times. So I'm very fortunate that I'm in the kind of position I am, that I was able to, you know.
Mark was on a couple of weeks ago. He studied comics up there. He was one of the first classes. He studied comics, and I think we talk about like comics having a resonance these days. I always think about, well, more recently and more, I look at Warren Ellis's Transmetropolitan.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And you know, if you look at America in the last 4 years, and you know, even what's happening in you know, in this country in the last 24 hours or so, Transmetropolitan.
Yep.
Is marvelously prophetic.
Well, I just think I think art has always been the first and the last form of rebellion that we're left with. You know, whether you look at kind of graffiti as well as kind of comic work or zines, of course, you know, and in the broader kind of sequential art world, zines. I mean, this is where we can communicate, you know, really powerful, profound messages to people.
Yeah, definitely. Which brings us on to the comics that you yourself were involved in.
So
we'll talk about.
So I guess, well, I'm going to take one quick step back. Before we did the two comics, we experimented with something else first, and what we were interested in. I was on another podcast a few weeks ago, from a work perspective, talking about empathy and the idea of empathy as an intervention, both as, you know, mental health nurse, but also just as a human being, about, you know, listening to people, trying to understand people's points of view. Is really important. And so what we did was we took, I was teaching mental health to a whole range of nursing students of different fields of nursing, and I was working with an artist from Duncan of Jordanstown, and we, and Lorraine, the artist, was creating pieces of art inspired by mental health themes. Then we were giving those pieces of art to nursing students, and asking them to sort of imagine how the person had felt as they were creating the art. Tell us your thoughts and feelings. So here's that, you know, a picture of a broken light bulb in a puddle. That was one of the pieces of work. What thoughts and feelings might go alongside that kind of you know, creation of that kind of work? And it was about building empathy. It was about helping people try to understand other people's points of view more fully. And the research told us that art is an empathic experience. As you look at a piece of art, whether that's comic art or other forms of art, you try and make sense of it from your own frame of reference, and then thereby you build some degree of empathy. So we started with a wee evidence-based that by giving students bits of art, we could help them think differently about other people's distress. And that was the sort of introduction to the idea of comics. So what we did in 2018 was we brought together some third-year students who are on their degree, third-year mental health nursing students, some students from the School of Humanities at the university, the staff from the Centre for Comic Studies, so Chris Murray, Damon Herd, Golnar, some PhD students, Megan is a PhD student there, and we, in recognition of World Mental Health Day, we wanted to create comic about a subject that we know from my kind of professional background is really difficult to talk about, and that's suicide. And we wanted to generate stories from the experiences of the students, and we sent it to sort of a couple of different sort of charities as well that worked with people, young people and older people with mental health difficulties, so we could, you know, ensure that everyone that had a voice was heard. And essentially, to cut a long story short, we ended up with this comic here, Let's Talk About Suicide, which for me was a great moment because I kind of managed to get my wee face in as the editor, and you know, in a wee kind of introductory paragraph. And essentially what we've got in here are 4 different perspectives on
suicide. I was trying to find a way there to have you and that without me, but
That's all right. That's all right. You should be there too. So what we did was we asked the students to come up with stories based on their personal experience, their professional experience. So you can see us. There's me and my colleagues Charlie and Phil, Yvonne and Jackie Eccles and a few of the other staff and the students behind us in the background there that created it. So we got the students to start generating a kind of a narrative seed, an idea of what it could be. Then the staff from the School of Humanities and the School of Health Sciences worked with them to develop that into a script. Megan, Chris and I spent some time developing that, particularly with Damon and Golnar and Phil, and developing that into scripts. We then got the students, we brought some artists that were commissioned to come in and support the students in terms of developments of their own thumbnails as to how it might look. And then we commissioned the artists to take it to the kind of full extent. And so we ended up with, some really important stories in there. We had stories about someone who was bereaved as a result of suicide. We had stories of someone who was thinking about suicide, and that story in particular was a younger man. And what we had a lot of was, we saw his external narrative that I've talked about, and he was telling people he was fine, he was doing okay. And then we saw the thought bubble, which allowed us to see that actually his experience was very different. So it was just a really just powerful opportunity to tell a story in a really accessible way. We got to the finals in the UK Innovation and Education Award, which was phenomenal. We were commended for an Inclusive Practice Award because we were using the kind of point that visual communication is very inclusive, whether that's through literacy, English as a second language, all those kind of issues of inclusivity, that actually using a comic allowed us to reach out to more people. So we've circulated it and received some really, really positive and good feedback on that particular comic. So, it was called Let's Talk About Suicide because it's a difficult topic, just as some of the other stuff I've presented tonight is a difficult thing to talk about, but presenting it in this way. And the four people on the front are the characters from each of the four stories. Okay.
I mean, it absolutely is. I see it and hear about it all the time. That suicide is the silent killer in of the 21st century. It's particularly in young people and young males. Like this, it's the largest killer of certain age groups, and people. You always think if you only could have spoken to someone.
Yep.
We have an instance just now where a young lad is it's in the news, has killed himself in the local town. To us, don't know that lad personally, but you don't know what was going through their head or what would go through someone's head. They would get to a certain stage where they would think that taking their life was the best option, but yeah.
Well, I often get, in all my clinical work and academic work around suicide, it comes down to hope, which you've already mentioned in terms of Legion of Superheroes as a key theme was hopefulness. Mm-hmm. And actually that's what we tried to communicate in comics, really, isn't it? Hopefulness. And one of the things that's really interesting for me with that more kind of professional lens is that comics, particularly mainstream superhero comics, so you've got a DC, Marvel, Image, maybe a bit as well, it's maybe a wee bit darker, but many of the key messages from comics around mental health are actually really hopeful and positive, because if we think about most superheroes, their origin is often deeply tragic.
Yes.
Parental death is everywhere.
Yeah. Everywhere. Yeah, from Superman to Batman to Spider-Man to,
It's across the board. So one of the things, and I'll come back to X-Men actually in relation to my work in a minute, but comics are often hopeful because of the message that they take a trauma. I mean, the Hulk is an really interesting example actually, because the Hulk is a really kind of complex sort of, in terms of from a psychiatric perspective, the idea that he has dissociative personality disorder. The Hulk is the irradiated child of Banner rather than it being Banner itself. So when Banner found out that his father was very abusive towards him, mm-hmm. and as can be the case with people that have had traumatic childhoods, that dissociative idea of creating another sense of self.
Yeah.
So some of the stuff about Hulk's really interesting, that it's actually his enraged child that was irradiated. And actually, when you look at the Hulk's behaviour, leave me alone, I'm the strongest they are, he's calmed by maternal influence, all of these things are actually a really strong message about, his childhood trauma and the rage that... And it actually gives a voice and an image to people, I think, that have been through deeply distressing images, who actually have that anger, frustration and distress that feels like they could crack the earth in two. It can sometimes feel so overwhelming. And there's the Hulk actually showing us in comics that this is, trauma given a visual and being, used for good.
Week on week or month on month, he comes back from it and gets over it and things like that. I've never thought about that. I mean, whenever I've thought of the Hulk, I think I'm more of a sort of Jekyll and Hyde.
Jekyll and Hyde. I think that's the thing about comics, isn't it? This layer again. So I think you can look at the Hulk and you can just say, oh, he's really awesome. When he gets angry, he gets really strong. Wouldn't we like to be like that? And then you can be like, well, actually, it's about the dark nature, particularly of masculinity. And I know we're talking a lot lately about kind of toxic masculinity. Is the Hulk the expression of that? But for me, there's another deeper layer, and it's about his childhood trauma and how that was affected. And actually, I think lots of people who may look at comics who have had difficult childhoods can actually see there a way that they've conceptualized this trapped, enraged child who seeks certain things to soothe, and particularly for the Hulk, whether it's the Marvel Cinematic Universe and it's Black Widow, or whether it's Betty in the comics, there's a sort of a maternal, a strong female influence to calm him. Given his father's abusive nature over, the grave of his mum and so that's one of the things I love about comics. I could be the fanboy and just enjoy Planet Hulk, or you can deconstruct it, in a really helpful way.
I mean, there's a great. I'll say that at the moment the discussion is mostly around a lot of toxic masculinity and stuff like this. Superheroes, another one I think about in a similar vein is Hank Pym, the character of Ant-Man, who in the comics suffered from dissociative personality disorders, and that he had, he was several different superheroes, and at least one of them wasn't aware that the other ones existed. And also he was abusive towards his partner in the comics, and physically abusive. They glossed over that a little bit in the movies. They made him a bit angry and narky in the movies rather than actually physical. But even the Pym particles, the idea of men becoming small or becoming incredibly large plays into that sort of that idea, the trope of the aggressive, abusive man who's actually very small and insignificant in terms of their self-image, and they have to over-exaggerate, overcompensate for who they are. So even that, and again, you could apply these kind of lenses to all of these kind of scenarios, but there is, it's very, not to get too kind of psychological, but it's all kind of Carl Jung, it's archetypes, Yeah, I understand that. I just say I know someone called Carl Jung, so I think you're talking about Carl Jung, Jung, Carl Jung.
Aye, and Jungian ideas,
Just in case Carol's watching, Yeah, so that was also a great one, and then you did a second.
So what we did, I mean, the University of Dundee, through the Centre of Comic Studies, has done a lot of kind of health promoting kind of comics. So we've done things about bereavement, organ donation. It's important to me. We're waiting on a transplant, but we did one that I contributed to, Pandemic Tales, it's called, and the university just looked at lots of different impacts of the pandemic last summer. And in particular, there's a chapter in it which looks at nursing students' response to pandemic, because their course radically changed. A lot of them became paid employees of the NHS. We're kind of, and there we go. And I think the lecturer looks suspiciously like me in that sort of third panel. But this tells their story of what was it like as a nursing student to suddenly have your course radically change, to go into very early in your career into a scenario that you never thought you would in terms of something that would affect us globally, as the pandemic did. And so that was a really, I think that story will come in the future when we look back to now, because the danger is whilst we're in the in the middle of it, we don't see it as well. But I think some of these things are about recording history.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of this is going to be like the long-term effects of the actual illness itself aren't really understood just yet. The long-term mental effects of people, I feel bad for the student population at the moment. My youngest lad's a student this year, and he's nearly finished his first year, and he's never done it. He's done it entirely within the confines of his bedroom.
Yep.
So you're missing out on an entire, a massive part of student life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And other things as well. Obviously, nursing students at the moment, have had to step up, particularly the late year nursing students, to step up to be part of the NHS and to support the NHS in this time, doing a job that they're not paid for. It's crazy. It's a crazy world we're living in at the moment.
It certainly is. So I think the Suicide comic was about creating something for now, is how I felt about it. And the pandemic tales, while it's good to tell the story now, I think it will come back to that they are. So Louise is asking about them. Yeah, Louise, if you the university website, basically, Louise, if you just Google them, you won't. The Let's Talk About Suicide is currently unavailable because we need to make a small change to it. This is one of the interesting intersections between academia and comics. There's some research that's come out following our suicide comic that suggests that presenting methods of suicide in the media has risk associated with it for people that are vulnerable. Yeah. That only came out in 2020. The Samaritans did the work. The comic was out in 2018. So obviously, from a public safety point of view, we want to, once we've dealt with lots of sort of changes in our programming and COVID, just adapt it slightly so the risk isn't there. But Louise, I'll message you on Facebook. I can get you copies, and that's absolutely no problem. There we go. Right, I know I've talked a lot, Andrew. Is there anything?
No, that's fine. Like I say, part of the reason I got you on here was to talk about things like this. It's I see firsthand myself, and I've experienced firsthand myself the effects of not being able to get out of the house, not being able to do anything, maybe not being able to work. If you've got a business, watching the business that you've built, struggle and stuff like this. This has been a mental struggle for me and for many other people, and that was part of the reason why I want to speak to you this week, Grant. But yeah, we'll try and veer now a wee bit towards slightly less serious.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I live really close to the shop, and usually my evening walk takes me past it, and it does. My heart does. I'll be honest, my heart does sink for you almost every day when I walk past that and see, the shutters down.
Well, I've been in the shop in the last week or so, and I'm starting to get it set up ready for reopening. So you'll be glad to hear.
Fantastic.
And given the current guidance, hopefully it just came out this week. But hopefully the first week in April, I think the 5th of April, we should be open now for click and collect, and then the 26th of April we will be reopening for people to come in. So that'll be excellent. I've been getting lots of new stuff in.
Great.
It's starting to build up here in my house, to be honest with you. My wife's driven to distraction. There's boxes everywhere now. When you have releases of Pokemon and Magic the Gathering and Hero Clips and things like that, they're all arriving, and I can't get them to go to the shop, so they're all filling in here. So,
I mean, for me, and clearly the restrictions. I mean, I'm on the sort of shielding category, so I've for a year pretty much been at home. But your shop is probably, in my opinion, now I'm 45. I've been in Kirkcaldy probably 35 years, something like that. I moved slightly north into Fife. I've never been a great adventurer. I've always wanted to stay fairly close to my parents and family. That's been important for me. But your shop's been one of the great successes for me of kind of retail market, from the indoor market along to the Olympia Arcade, along to that. Great. I mean, that's just a fantastic premises you've got now. I mean, it really is a hope kind of story for me.
It is. I mean, it helps obviously that I work alone. It's not necessary for me to have multiple people in to the shop, so I've not got an awful lot of overheads beyond the actual physical shop thing, and that's what's allowed me, I think, to succeed where other, there was a previous comic shop here and thing like that, and with people working in it and things like this. Most of the independent comic shops, and I know most of the guys who run independent comic shops in Scotland, most of them are one-man businesses. Just by dint of, it's a labour of love.
Well, and it's interesting, sort of labour of love, because what I was thinking about, just tying it together, the sort of themes of lockdown, business, mental health, is being a lone trader. Obviously, you've spoken there very clearly about that there's some advantages to that as well. But I imagine the sort of just the pressure, though, just on you, and it's not a therapy session by any means, but it's kind of recognising the humanity within getting comics to people. As you say, it's a labour of love. It's not just a job, and it must be pretty burdensome kind of experience at times. I mean, we've all seen your Facebook posts about needing the pull lists, to get collected. I can't imagine being in your position and carrying that kind of, because like you and I have said before, you're no shop, you're a community. You facilitate a community experience for people. It's much more than a retail experience.
Yeah, people don't just come in and buy something and leave generally. Most of the time people will come in, even if it's only a 5-minute chat, they'll stand, they'll chat. For some people it's a habitual 10-minute chat. For some people they can be in for an hour. And I'm very conscious that for a lot of these people, I might be the only person outside their household that they speak to. So, I spend a lot of time in the shop on my own as well, so I don't mind, generally speaking, the company. Even though it means sometimes I do have to have the same conversations over and over again. Whenever a movie comes out,
I was going to say, as soon as there's a release, that's what's going to be the topic. Yeah, I mean, if the shop had been open just now, I don't know how often you would have heard Zack Snyder's name in the last month.
Well,
you probably should get a wee jar up,
We'll certainly be talking about that next week, because I think it's out tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I know I've got access to it on Sky.
Is it Sky? So, right, okay.
6 o'clock tomorrow morning, I believe.
Right.
Is its first showing.
Are you going to be up for? Are you getting up for it, or are you going to wait?
I'm not, but I'll certainly be watching it before my next show.
Yeah.
So it's worth taking. I think it's worth taking the Sky movies for 1 month. Actually, Now TV. If you're looking for it, Now TV will give you a 7-day free trial of movies. And you can get it, watch a Justice League movie, and then cancel it so that Rupert Murdoch doesn't get any of your money.
Absolutely.
James Murdoch now it would be actually.
Yeah.
So I'm very much looking forward to it. For what I've heard and for wee bits and bobs that I've sort of seen already. I've seen a couple of clips where it's already a massive
improvement.
Yeah, there's a scene at the very beginning, or very close to the beginning, where Wonder Woman, which was in the original movie, where Wonder Woman goes into the law courts and foils a terrorist attack. And I've seen the longer version of that, and it is outstanding.
And okay,
even just that one small scene that was a 2-minute scene, which is maybe now a 4-minute scene, is much better.
Well, it's like like I think it was last week I commented. The Ben Affleck Daredevil movie is okay. The director's cut is just it's amazing how just a few differences can make a huge difference.
Yeah, I think having somebody like any movie should be allowed to be the sort of province of one person, because generally speaking, if you take a movie and one person makes it and then another person cuts it, it never works out well. And superhero movies in particular we feel that, Josh Trank's Fantastic Four, apparently there's a cut of that somewhere, which is an exceptional movie. which is kind of what you would expect because he's a good movie maker.
Yeah. I'm a big Fantastic Four. In fact, if you were to pin me down and say, who's your favourite superhero? Because we all have these conversations. I tell you, Franklin Richards, the Impossible Boy, is on there for me. You know,
I love there's so many variations of him. I think there's
the Hickman run. I adored the Hickman run where you saw him as the adult and it took you into Secret Wars. That was great. But the idea of the boy who can create universes with his mind touches us all as boys and girls. That's we were all there. We were all that person who had an imagination that was kind of not beaten out of us by adult life, but adult life doesn't value.
It's subsumed.
Imagination.
Put away childish things and stop doing childish things and move on to more adult things.
Exactly.
I still make up stories. I still do a bit of writing and a bit of drawing, and I still make up things. We talked about earlier on about sitting in your garden reading your comics and things like this, and I didn't have that because I didn't have anybody local. So for me, I was sitting in my garden sometimes, but I was writing comics and drawing comics that were massively derivative. I had a team of 5 superheroes who basically were the original X-Men, with just slightly different things. Instead of Iceman, you had Fireboy and things like this. Very derivative sort of stuff. But
so you mentioned X-Men. So the Hickman run. I mean, the Hickman run and Fantastic Four, and I've loved the X-Men stuff from Hickman as well. I'm working my way through the Powers X, House of X stuff as well. But when I was 18 years old, and I went for my interview at university.
That's cool.
There you go. Here comes.
I've not at the moment got any Star Wars 3 3/4 or 6-inch figures in. Sometimes we get the Black Label figures in as they're released for movies and stuff like this. But at the moment, I didn't have anything in. Colin. Sorry, Grant.
No, that's absolutely fine. So 18 years old, I went and applied to study mental health nursing, and long story, dropped out. It was about the time I gave away all my comics. It was a crisis period for me. Returned later. In that interview, I remember someone who then eventually went on to be my colleague that I worked with until he retired a few years ago, Dr. Bob Rankin, said to me, "Why do you want to become a mental health nurse?" And my answer at 18 was, "I read these comics and they're called the X-Men, and they're about people who are different and they get treated badly because they're different. Actually, they just want to be helpful." And it was a really kind of powerful kind of message for me as a young boy that being different was okay, whatever that meant. And, it's good to help people, and it's good to, use your talents and abilities to make the world a better place,
Yeah. Sean, that's what we were talking about just a while ago there. It drops on Sky tomorrow morning. Zack Snyder's Justice League cut. So get out there. We'll no doubt be talking about it at the weekend.
My favourite Justice League story is I've got.
If you don't say Kingdom Come, then I'm cutting you off.
Do you know what? I held Kingdom Come in my hand. Because as Alex Ross's biggest fan next to probably next to nobody really, I thought that would be a winner. But I'm a big Brad Meltzer fan actually, and so Identity Crisis.
Okay, yeah.
For me, took what was that a very big universe and made it that storyline between Elongated Man, Sue Dibney.
That's the one where Ralph
Dr. Light
gets killed.
Yeah, she gets killed. There's a history between her and Dr. Light. I mean, Dr. Light rapes her. Yeah. It's a really distressing thing. So she does get killed. They all assume it's Dr. Light coming back, but it's just this intimate story of grief. And there's the panels in there where where Ralph's at the and actually it makes me emotional thinking about it, and that's why I love it, because this comic made me cry when I read it. He's standing at his wife's funeral, giving the eulogy, and he can't talk, but because of course he's made of rubber, his just face, his jaw, it just all gives way. And what a beautiful metaphor for how we feel about grief. He couldn't hold himself together literally as we can't metaphorically. Just a very powerful story,
there's a great point sort of later on in that story as well, where, and I don't want to give it too much away, but when you find out the actual guilty party, and they show no remorse, and it's like they're, they can't even conceive that what they did was wrong. Almost.
No, because they thought it was for the right reason.
Yeah.
Which is, we've talked about history a lot, but doing the wrong thing for what someone believed was the right reason has, caused probably most of our human problems.
DC got a lot of grief for that sort of thing as well. After Kyle Rayner's girlfriend was also killed by one of these things.
In the fridge.
In the fridge, yeah. And it became like a thing that DC do now. If you want to move along a character, if you want to give a character, some depth, we'll fridge his girlfriend or we'll fridge his wife. To the extent that even, they did it in the second Deadpool movie, and it became did they just fridge her? It became an actual part of it. It's become part of the mythos. I don't think they do it anymore because it was pointed out to DC that, having the female character or having the female partner of a character killed just to move the story along was in possibly bad taste.
Absolutely, and it's we've talked a wee bit about sort of some of the societal issues around masculinity, toxic masculinity, and comics have had to evolve to address that as well. In terms of sort of gender balance and kind of from the sort of traditional kind of Sue, we've talked about Fantastic Four. Sue getting a nosebleed every time she makes a force field. That kind of will give her power, but will actually give her kind of a weakness. So that I think misogyny in comics is being addressed at some level.
Yeah, I think how women and girls are portrayed in comics has been hugely problematic for a long time. The overt sexualization of characters, even young characters, even the way Kitty Pryde was on when she was 12, 13, 14 in the comics, artists still were portraying her as they would, full-grown women.
Emma Frosting them, I think, is the phrase.
Yeah, Emma Frosting. I think they're getting away from that now. There's been a bit of a kickback in the last few years. DC had a lot of problems when it relaunched the New 52 and their Starfire character. How she was portrayed was a massive thing. Covers by Milo Marinara and I think it was his name earlier, and Frank Cho and stuff like this. I've had a lot of pushback. So they're addressing it.
I think we've managed to go for an hour without talking about WandaVision, which is probably good. But there's a really powerful kind of recentering of a focus on essentially two female leads, between Wanda and Agatha, and I guess and they want to spoil anything else about it. I think it's a positive move that we are seeing.
Now for a week and a half, we can do spoilers now. 10 days is the spoiler limit. I think I'm already
10 days out.
The two female leads, because Vision, Vision was almost a voyeur, not a voyeur.
He was a little bit of us. He was the kind of observing and realising there was something not quite right. So I think he was partly us in the story, a little bit of something's not right.
Wanda and Agatha knew what was going on. And Wanda didn't know that Agatha knew. So, WandaVision, I can't rave about it enough. Even though some people are complaining that the finale fell a little bit flat. I think it wrapped up the story pretty well. And left multiple storylines open for them to explore in the future.
Well, especially when you hear the voice of the boys.
Sorry, I missed that.
So especially when you hear the voice of the boys in the final line, sort of, that.
And as a comic fan like that, I know that there's been, she in the comics she went on to create. There was a House of M.
There's House of M, and then you had the Children's Crusade as well, where the boys went looking for her.
Aye. Well, the House of M, she created House of M to bring the kids back to life almost. And they've been taken from her by Agatha Harkness. Or she blamed Agatha and murdered her.
And from a professional perspective, I teach a lot about grief and loss as well, and actually that sort of denial. What would any of us do if we had the power to change things? I think many of us would.
You would, yeah. I mean, you would certainly. Anybody who's lost someone, whether it be a child, a sibling, a mother, a father, of like that. Anybody would you know, you would change the whole world to have them back.
At the cost of your own soul, you would do it. And as Louise says there, Wanda's strong and vulnerable, you know. And I think that's a really nice way to kind of describe her. We now know she's going to be one of the strongest people in the universe, stronger than the Sorcerer Supreme, even.
Possibly, and will possibly be in that movie if the rumours are to be true.
But inherently vulnerable, as Louise says, tremendous loss. Her parents, her brother. That's a whole other side story. But you know, her parents, her brother, her children, who were.
Well, yeah. I mean, again, going back to how comics deal with things. You know, that was the first ever. There was an incestuous quality to their relationship in the Ultimate Universe comics, and it's something I've never seen portrayed in a Marvel comic. You know, or a DC comic. It's you know, there's certain taboo subjects which they didn't shy away from in their relationship. That was never main universe. There was never, you know, any suggestion of anything like that. In the main universe, Peter has only ever loved himself.
Yeah.
So you talk about favourite comic characters, and it's a crazy one because I loved Evan Peters as Pietro in the movies that he did. Quicksilver's probably my least favourite superhero character.
Okay.
Across the big two. He's just a whiny, self-entitled, you know, boy. He's got his girl. He's himself. He's just a dick. He's just.
Yes, it is. Well, you see, this takes me to a really interesting place because you know. One of the other things, I know we're almost out of time, but I'm really interested in how spirituality is portrayed in relation to superheroes. There's a great book somewhere.
Daredevil is probably my favourite thing. Like that, it's intrinsic to his character.
So, Holy Superheroes is all about the idea, and in psychology, superheroes, great book, plugging them all, but it's just to widen that kind of world of booking. But you know, Superman. When you look at Superman, it's a messianic story. I mean, it's you know, they got as close to quoting Jesus as they possibly could. You know, Martha and Jonathan versus Mary and Joseph, Lex Luthor, Lucifer. You know, it's absolutely a Christian analogy. But the thing about Superman,
the death and rebirth that they did, you know,
the death, rebirth, that whole voiceover of you are a light to the children, my son. You know, that whole bit. But the thing that made Superman great was Clark Kent, not Kal-El. You know, it wasn't his powers that made him a great person. You know, it was, X Factor 87 is great. They go to the therapist. I've got that. But the other therapy one, of course, is not so good. But Heroes in Crisis is about the same idea of how do people experience so much vicarious trauma and survive. But so the thing about Quicksilver being the power doesn't make you great. You know, it's the same with Superman. We then found out loads of Kryptonians were, well, dicks, to use your words, when we had, you know, when Krypton returned and all of that, and it turned out actually what makes people great is just who they are and their values, not what power they may or may not have, you know.
Yeah, I think the world of New Krypton, when the Kryptonians arrived, they thought they were justified in terraforming the Earth, and this was in the comics as well as in the movie, because it suited them. Superman was great because of his humanity, because of his upbringing, because of Jonathan and Martha Kent.
Because of his weakness.
Yeah.
That was it, you know?
A weakness. And that's what defines us. It's the weaknesses that define you as a superhero. It was I could see that going. Superman was one of my all-time favourites. And talking earlier on, John was talking earlier on about when Superman he was so overcome by his actions of killing Zod that he became gangbuster and repressed it, and that goes back to what we were talking about with the Hulk and Hank Pym.
Well, I brought my favourite Superman just in case. Superman for all seasons.
Mm-hmm.
For me, just the nostalgia of the page, just this way the story is written is just lovely. Just absolutely, and you know, I know that's a bit of a weak word, but it's just a lovely, lovely read. You know, and it's about the humanity of him rather than the, you know, extraterrestrial.
This is why you'll know my favourite superhero of all time is the proper Captain Marvel.
Yes.
Not the Marvel Captain Marvel.
Shazam.
That's what they call him these days. But there's always been a certain hope about Shazam, because fundamentally he's like the Hulk. He's a giant, powerful man with the mind and the psyche of a teenage boy, and he's always been, he's got that hopeful enthusiasm and belief that only kids can have. Once you get to school and leave school, it's like get to work and you get that sort of enthusiasm, that hope beaten out of you by adult life. And Captain Marvel never had that, and that's why he'll always be the number one for me. Amazing comic. The art is awesome too. I think John's still talking about X Factor '87. Yeah. Who was the artist on that? Was it Joe Quesada?
I think it was. Yeah.
Yeah. That's us down for an hour.
Fantastic.
You'll have other things to do. I want to thank you for coming on.
Oh, delighted. Good to get. I was thinking, it's funny. I don't know if the podcast is going to get a kind of a name or not. But as I was thinking about coming on tonight, I was just thinking about all of our other conversations, which run into hours, I guess, if we totaled that all up.
Yeah,
was over the countertop. That was the phrase that kept coming to my mind. It was, you and I talking over the countertop, and I thought actually that just sums up a comic shop community nicely, doesn't it? Over the countertop.
Because within the next few weeks I'll be working, because Wednesday night is big D&D in the shop, so I'll be trying to keep this running, but I'll be doing it from within the confines of High Street Kirkcaldy rather than trying to work from my wee office here. So yeah, over the counter.
Over the counter, yeah.
Conversations. That could work. I'm going to trademark that. I had that idea. This is how I remember it. I might have to edit this one before I put it up on YouTube tomorrow.
Well, I'm sure you've thought about all of those words together at some point, so you've probably nothing's original. Everything's derivative,
Everything. So that's been great. I want to thank everybody for watching. Thanks for all your comments as we've gone along. As always, this will be available from tomorrow on my YouTube channel. 8 subscribers now. I'm going to become a YouTuber. I'm going to become like Logan Paul and retire and have a big boat, stuff like this.
And start threatening random celebrities.
I think which celebrity would I start with? Piers Morgan?
Joss Whedon.
Joss Whedon, that's a whole podcast just to speak about Joss Whedon. So. That's Louise saying thanks, great, totally engaging. Thanks, Louise.
Cheers, Louise. Or to be honest, I don't really know Louise as Louise. Louise will always be her nickname to me through my entire life, which is Loopy.
Loopy.
Absolutely.
Is that a Loopy Loo thing from? You don't have to go into that online.
No.
I'm sure she'll message you personally. John Bruce is agreeing.
There you go.
Loopy. Thanks, John. Thanks, Loopy. Thanks to everyone who's spoken. Colin, Ian, Kirsty, everyone. We'll be back again next week. I'm not sure who we'll have on with us next week. I've got a couple of ideas. It might be a recasting, but we'll be back here again in a week's time. Thanks for joining us, and I'll speak to you next time. Cheers,
Thanks,
guys.
everyone. Good night.